Good evening, boys and ghouls, and welcome to the channel. I am D, your friendly neighborhood movie buff and humble host of the evening. As you all know, we are coming up on Halloween, my favorite holiday, which may or may not be cancelled this year because everything totally sucks right now. Well, every year for Halloween I try to do something special, and since I'm not allowed to work right now anyway, I decided to kick off this channel that's been on the drawing board for a while. And what better way to do it than listing off my favorite horror movies for each decade. You know, like everyone else on YouTube and their mother. But anyway, let's start with a brief history. The first horror movie is usually said to be The Haunted Castle from 1896, directed by pioneering movie legend Georges Méliès. Whether or not it's actually a horror film can be debated, of course, but you have to start somewhere. During the late 1800s and early 1900s, there were a slew of short films that come off as more or less creepy to our modern eyes by their sheer outlandishness. Categorizing anything from this era is difficult to say the least, and it wasn't until we got into the silent film era proper that genres as we see it really was a thing. So for the sake of preserving my sanity, let's stick to the 1920s today and limit this particular list to a top 5. Sure, there were more horror movies made, but things get kinda dicey once you dig too deep in the silent era. So here's my list for the top 5 horror films of the 20s. Der Golem, also known as How He Came Into the World, tells the classic story of the Golem of Prague, of Jewish folklore. Written and co-directed by Paul Wegener, who also stars as the titular character, this movie is considered a classic in the German expressionist movement, which intersected with the horror genre of the time. It is not the first movie about said Golem, however. Wegener made 2 other Golem films before this one, and this is supposed to be kind of a prequel to his 1915 film, also titled Der Golem. That one has been lost, however, although part of it was rediscovered quite recently. The second one is lost too, making this third movie the only one in the trilogy that is readily available. With movies this old, the record is often quite spotty. In a sense, we should be thankful for the films we still have, and Der Golem is certainly a piece of history that I am glad is still around. Hexen. This Danish and Swedish co-production is one of very few Scandinavian movies to make it onto my list, even though I am, in fact, Scandinavian myself. Hexen is a story about witchcraft and devils during the Middle Ages, and it contains some surprisingly graphic imagery and disturbing scenes in a way that honestly wouldn't be common again for several decades. It reads partly as a documentary about beliefs and punishments surrounding witches, and partly as a full-on nightmare, with shorter stories collected into a greater narrative. The movie is a bit of a slow burn, but seriously, I recommend watching it at least once. You'll never see anything quite like it. One of the big names in early American horror cinema is Lon Chaney, known as the Man of 1,000 Faces. The Phantom of the Opera from 1925 might be his most iconic performance. The story, I suppose, is familiar to most, with the Phantom being a deformed man who lives beneath the Paris Opera House, terrorizing performers and audience alike. It's not quite as dreamy as more modern depictions, though. The movie hits all the points of the classic question of who really is a monster, and Lon Chaney perfectly depicts a phantom that is both terrifying and endearing. Like many movies of the age, Phantom of the Opera is a bit on the slow side, but still, it's definitely worth your time. The Cabinets of Dr Caligari. This is another classic of the German expressionist movement, and it's been hotly debated whether it should be considered a horror movie at all. I personally find it intrinsically linked with the genre and quite impossible to exclude entirely. The story revolves around a sleepwalker named César, kept in suspended animation in the titular cabinet of the titular doctor, who also controls the somnambulist and commands him to carry out his dirty deeds. We're told early on that the narrator of the movie is by design unreliable, which leads to a somewhat disjointed story and even something of a twist ending, if you will. Whether it's horror or not, to anyone interested in the history of the genre, this is pretty much required viewing. This time there's no debating the genre. This is indeed a horror movie. Nosferatu is often called the first vampire movie, although there might be one or two short films from the late 1800s that could technically claim that title. It's hard to say. What is certain is that it's definitely the first movie version of Dracula. The filmmakers didn't have the rights to the book, however, and under threat of a lawsuit they changed the name of the vampire in the movie, but in most modern prints the name has been changed back again. Some of the most recognizable shots in cinema history can be found here, and the movie has a dreamlike, haunting feel to it, quite unlike anything seen today really. It feels a bit like watching David Lynch's Dune or the first Conan movie, if that makes sense. Anyway, Nosferatu was a definite milestone in horror cinema and my choice for the #1 spot on the list. And that was my pick for the best horror movies of the silent era. If you have an hour or two to kill, I also strongly recommend looking up some of those early short films, which are often available on YouTube. I'll put some links below to a couple of noteworthy ones if you're interested. Now, I know many people think silent films are difficult to watch because of the lack of dialogue or the unfamiliar pacing. My usual tip is, just put the movie on mute, pop on your headphones and watch it with whichever soundtrack you prefer. It can help a lot, and it's fun to see how much the viewing experience can change with your choice of music. Next time we take a look at the 30s, which is where sound enters the picture. Join me then and help me count the days to Halloween. Thanks for watching, catch you on the flip side.